Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar for the 2024 Charleston Virtual Conference. This session is titled When the Rubber Hits the Road, Perspectives on Open Access and Transformative Agreements. I'm your moderator, Christina Hubish. I am an open access analyst for Elsevier. I've been working here for about 6 years and mostly focused exclusively on open access data and understanding publishing trends at institutions who have transformative agreements. So a few housekeeping rules for today. This is a pre-recorded webinar, so the format is a little bit different, but so we're not live on the screen right now, but we are going to be live with you in the webinar. So please pop any questions in or any dialogue that you have into the Q&A, and there will be some of us live with you to answer them as the recording proceeds. Now to introduce our panelists, we have Michael Levine Clark from the University of Denver Libraries. We have Jennifer Matthews from Rowan University, and we have Craig Ostlick from CRKN, all three of whom are representing institutions who started transformative agreements this year in 2024 with Elsevier. So I will hand it over to the panelists to introduce themselves in a bit more detail, and we can start with Michael.
Thanks, Christina, and nice to be in front of everybody here at Charleston. I'm the Dean of Libraries at the University of Denver, and I'm also a member of the Colorado Alliance of Research Libraries negotiating team for our transformative agreement with Elsevier. And I'm also have for a long time been the co-chair of the Colorado Alliance Shared Collection Development Committee. University of Denver is a relatively small R1. We're probably one of the smallest R1 institutions. And for those of you from international institutions who are tuning in, R1 is Research 1. It's the highest research category of institutions in the US, and there are about 140 R1 institutions. Because we're a relatively small R1, we don't publish nearly as much as the giant institutions, and it makes it in some ways harder to manage some of these agreements because we don't have huge volume, but it also makes it a little easier to enter them because we are small enough that the costs of APCs are relatively low.
Great, and over to Jennifer.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jennifer Matthews. I'm the collection strategy librarian at Rowan University. Rowan University is an R2, just about to become an R1. Actually, we'll probably do it in the next year or two. And we're unusual in that we have two, soon to be three distinct different types of medical libraries, which adds to our publication output, obviously. We just, as Christina mentioned, we just entered into this Elsevier. I'm the person that does all of the negotiations for all of our contracts at Rowan University. So I was able to do this agreement with Elsevier and has been able to sort of see this put into play. And it's been really sort of fascinating to watch the acceptance on campus.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And Craig?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Craig, and I'm the director for the content program at the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, or shortened to CRKN, up here in Canada. I've been with CRKN about 14 years now in various roles, but always related to licensing and open access. And now I'm responsible for just managing and directing the entire open access program and licensing program of CRKN. And I was the lead negotiator on the Elsevier read and publish agreement that we entered into starting this year, 2024. Just a little bit quickly about CRKN. We're the National Academic University Library Consortium. We have about 80 institutional members now. I think roughly 71, I think, take part in the Elsevier agreement. So yeah, we're a fairly large national consortium, and we have estimated about between 9,000 and 10,000 articles per year published in Elsevier journals.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So we have quite a breadth here. We have the R1 with Denver, and then the R2, almost R1 with Rowan, and then the large academic national system with Canada, with CRKN there. Thank you. Thank you for those introductions. So with that said, I think that we will go ahead and kind of dive into some of the questions. So the first category that we have that we wanted to talk about with regard to transformative agreements is building the agreement. So we're going to start with Craig, we would like to hear from you on how did you define the key parameters of your transformative agreement with CRKN, and how did you collaborate with any key stakeholders to ensure their alignment?
Sure, happy to start on this topic. And I guess I'll just begin by saying that the Elsevier agreement was, I think, our fifth transformative style or read and publish agreement that we negotiated. So not the first, but it was somewhat of an early one, maybe a early to mid one. And so we had some experience negotiating ones prior to this negotiation, but none, of course, that were quite as significantly as large as this one. However, having said that, the CRKN membership had put in place some fairly strong criteria for what we had to achieve as a negotiating team when entering into these types of agreements. And those two criteria or principles, what have you, the first one being cost neutrality, and the second one being unlimited publication or no publication cap within the agreements. So how we define those two things, I can cover quickly as well. Cost neutrality we think of in terms of the idea that there's enough money within the subscription read agreement system to pay for open access globally. And so we take that to heart also at a national level here at Canada, saying that essentially the amount that we're paying for a subscription agreement should be sufficient to transition us towards a read and publish agreement that covers both reading and covering the open access fees or the APCs. So that means, for example, with the Elsevier agreement in Canada, prior to the implementation of this year's read and publish, the average, I think, was in hybrid journals, Canadian authors were paying roughly $2.5 million annually in hybrid APCs. And so through their research grants or through other means, not coming directly through the library and certainly not through the consortium. So that cost neutrality for us meant that there was going to be no adding of that revenue into our agreement. And in other words, what we had paid for the subscription would be sufficient to cover our transition to reading and publishing. So that was the first principle. Second one being the unlimited publications. The reason for that largely has to do with not wanting to be put in a position near the end of a year or near the end of a contract where we run out of tokens or APC waivers and have authors all of a sudden be expected to pay for APCs. So that was something that was of clear priority for us and that we had achieved in all of our other read and publish agreements as well. So those were the two main criteria in terms of how we defined, I guess, the key parameters of what we were hoping to achieve with that negotiation, which I'm happy to say we eventually did. And I'll just move on now to the second part of this question, which is how do we collaborate with stakeholders to ensure their alignment? Mm-hmm. And I guess speaking from a library consortium perspective rather than an institutional one like my two other co-presenters will touch on from that viewpoint, our direct stakeholders are our member libraries. So obviously downstream from that, faculty and students are the end users and the beneficiaries of the work that we do at CRKN. But we answer to our members first and foremost, those members being the academic libraries themselves. So we have a content strategy committee that acts as a proxy for our larger membership. And that committee is very engaged with members throughout the whole process of developing our strategy for read and publish agreements and the negotiation of these deals. And our institutional members are involved with the negotiations, and they play a key role towards the end of the process as well when they meet with us at the annual in-person CRKN Summit, usually in October. And they can provide final guidance on the last stretch of negotiations and towards implementation at that point. So we involve them throughout the whole process through that committee.
Okay, interesting. And Michael, how does your institution compare?
Similar in some ways. So I think it's worth noting that the University of Denver has 6 different transformative agreements. Elsevier happened somewhere in the middle. We're interested in transformative agreements, but we're interested with some similar criteria. We don't want to pay more than an existing big deal. We sort of, after a bit of back and forth, we decided that we could go with a slightly higher amount if that was sort of the sticking point. But by slightly higher amount, I mean a percentage point or so on the annual increase. We didn't want to have any limits on the number of articles that would be published for the similar reasons to what Craig stated. And we also wanted to make sure that our agreements would allow for publication in both gold and hybrid journals, not a limited number of amounts. And we were successful in, and I should say that is fundamentally about ease of use and ease of understanding for the people who are publishing, right? We don't want to be able to say, we don't want to have to say, we have a deal with this publisher. You can publish some articles, but you're going to have to figure it out as you go in to start submitting. It's too confusing, and it really should be everything across the entire deal. We initially worked with two publishers. One was Cambridge University Press, and the other was IOP Press, Institute of Physics, or IOP Publishing. I mean, who could meet those criteria, right? That it was kind of unlimited publishing within that publisher, unlimited publishing in terms of types of publication, and no big increase on the cost of that deal. The Elsevier one is a little bit different, and we ended up sort of moving away from all of those principles in a way. It was a deal negotiated at the consortial level, and we've had a very long-standing big deal with Elsevier, the Freedom Collection, in the Colorado Alliance of Research Libraries, and in this renegotiation, we had some competing goals as a group. So we wanted to save money. In fact, we had institutions that needed to save a lot of money. We also had institutions that wanted very much to participate in a read and publish deal of some sort. And then we also have 4 R1s down to some really tiny schools that barely publish anything on an annual basis. And we needed to bring them all together. And we ended up with a deal that allowed some institutions to cut their costs by decreasing the size of their overall package. And we had some schools that weren't interested in read and publish because they don't publish much to begin with, and they just participated in a sort of standard Freedom Collection deal. And then we had 2 of us who wanted to do a read and publish deal within this larger package. And I should say right up front that I'm a transformative agreement skeptic. I don't actually believe that they're going to transform things. I think that any step we can take toward open access is good, but I also have a lot of questions about how well they actually work, right. Which is why I wanted to participate. It was especially why I wanted to participate in a deal that was sort of multi-form across our consortium, because I think it gives us an opportunity over time to do some comparisons of what it worked out as for a smaller deal, standard deal, and transformative agreement. And so just quickly, the elements that we had in this deal at University of Denver from Elsevier is we do have a limit in the number of publications we can make. We also can only publish essentially for free in hybrid journals. There's a discount on APCs for gold journals, but that is not what we wanted. But we decided in the end that it was worth doing this as an experiment. So hopefully at the end of it, we can give a presentation that explains why that was a bad idea. I'll stop there.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you, Michael. And then over to Jennifer.
Yes. So being a single institution as opposed to a consortia like Michael and Craig, we approached it probably a little bit differently, but had many similar things in mind. We do have a cap on hours, but we looked at publication output for our agreement, and we have not hit our cap this year at all. We so far have been doing very well with what we have done. But some of the key parameters that I went in with everything was not just looking at the overall output for our agreement, but also, making sure that we had the neutrality, but also wanting to make sure that things were painless for our authors. We wanted them to make sure, that when they went in and requested this agreement, that they made the request and then it came over and they didn't have to worry about it again. It just comes over to the library and it gets approved, and they don't have to worry about it again. I didn't want it to be any different for them, cause any hiccups for them at all, right? And it has been, and we've seen it just sort of take off because of that. And I think that that is sort of key with, especially since we had, we went from having just 3 before the beginning of the year to 18 agreements with the beginning of this year.
Wow.
And this was the second agreement that I negotiated for the start of this year. So it was important to have things like that considered with all of the different agreements that I was doing, because it was important to make sure that the faculty were not having to, negotiate this aspect with this agreement and that aspect with this one. Everything had to be absolutely seamless for them, and that they didn't have to do any extra steps as they were going through. They just had to choose row and go. In terms of collaborating with stakeholders, the key thing that sort of set everything off in looking into these agreements is that we knew from our provost that he was very interested in making sure that our faculty's research was available out there. So we knew we had support at the administrative level. This is all coming out of our library budget. We didn't get any extra funds. So it was also important that as I went through this process, that I was talking with not just the associate provost of libraries, but also the director of each of the medical libraries as we went through, so that they were aware of all of the contract terms that I was negotiating, any impact if I was not able to get a neutral thing for their budgets, so that they knew the terms and everything before any agreement was brought forward to be signed, and that they knew how things were going to lay out. And then once the agreement was signed, it's also working with the scholarly and communication librarian and our marketing and communication staff member, so that they can start marketing these agreements out.
Sure. Yeah. And it's interesting that, despite the difference in the institutional profiles that you described, right, some of those themes do transcend the cost neutrality, right, the ability for authors to kind of understand the workflow, for example, and be able to kind of accept these APCs as they've been given by the library. So kind of speaking of that kind of implementation journey, I would like to hear from Michael first, actually. Just after signing your agreements, you've mentioned you've had a few transformative agreements. What are some of the steps that you typically take to put an agreement into practice? Are there any resources like funding or different infrastructure that you've had to arrange or that you're working on arranging to be able to kind of better support the implementation part of these agreements? Because it's not quite as easy as turning on reading access, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, and there are quite a few complicated steps, and they're, I think, a little bit different for every agreement. There was generally a back and forth or with the consortium for those that were through a consortium to help us to understand the terms and then to learn how to manage things on the back end, right? How does the dashboard work and so on. We needed to explain, and I should say I'm the dean. I was not the person who did any of these things, right? This is happening at the institution level, but I certainly don't want to take credit for it. We needed to explain how the deals worked and how sort of what the rules were of each deal to our reference librarians and to the students who stay at desk, because they need to be a resource that can help if there are any questions that come in, either about transformative agreements generally or open access publishing generally, or about, I'm trying to submit this article to Elsevier and I'm getting this message. What does that mean? At the point of a question at the reference desk, they certainly don't need to know the fine points of each agreement, but they need to know the basics, and they certainly need to understand what a transformative agreement is doing and what it's supposed to do. We added details about these agreements to a website, and I think probably more importantly, we tried to share details about each of these agreements as we signed them with our faculty through our liaison network, right? So the library liaison contacted each of our liaisons in the departments to explain what we're doing. And we've tried over the last several years as well to talk quite a bit in our library liaison meetings about what these agreements are and why we're interested in participating. We want to, the ideal in communicating with faculty would be to say something as simple as any article that you publish with publisher A will be fully open. All you have to do is submit it. You don't have to worry about anything else. That's not true, right? It's not how it's working. There's some hoops to jump through. There are limitations in most of these agreements on some level about which journals are included, and it's not as seamless a process as possible for faculty. So because of that, there's a lot of communication that has to happen. We also had to create more detailed guides for library staff to understand and manage these deals, and when necessary to answer questions from our authors, but certainly to manage them on the back end. I guess the other thing to say is that, well, I'll move on to the second question here fairly quickly and say that just as we didn't want to spend extra money on the front end on these deals, although with the caveat that we agreed that we'd be okay if there was a slight rise in the rate of increase from year to year. But we don't have money to increase personnel. Right, that's even more limited than our collections budget, and we certainly didn't have any money to put at this, right? So it needed to be a cost neutral operation in general. So we didn't add new staff. We didn't add new infrastructure. We sort of moved some workload around, but we're also a little early in this game, and we're a small enough publisher that I think that's sustainable for an institution of our size, right? If we were publishing at a higher volume, I might be answering this question entirely differently. We've also, I think, learned along the way that it's important to maintain spreadsheets and track participation and approvals on our own, and I'll get to why in a few questions.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I actually would like to stop you there because I'd be curious to hear from Craig, just kind of that counter kind of experience. You mentioned like I think you said 8,000 to 10,000 articles annually are being published throughout CRKN. So do you offer any kind of resources? I know you mentioned you don't work directly with the beneficiaries, but you do work with the libraries, right? Do you offer resources down to your libraries, or do they offer their own resources to be able to support implementation?
Yeah, well, think of everything Michael just described multiplied by 80 institutions throughout
Sure.
our consortium. You can imagine how much work it is. But implementation actually was a fairly straightforward process for us. Elsevier handled setting up all the accounts and stuff on the workflow end for authors naturally. And CRKN's members themselves have resisted taking on the administrative responsibility of validating and approving articles in our R&P deals. Like Michael alluded to, their staffing is stretched to the limits already as it is, so they don't have the capacity to take on a bunch of new extra work of this kind. So CRKN is handling all of this centrally for our agreements at this point, and in places where the publishers don't have an automatic approval system set up quite yet, which we are working on with Elsevier right now. But in an uncapped agreement such as ours, the validation process is a bit less critical than one compared to like where there is a finite number of APC waivers in place or available for authors. However, I mean, it is still an immense amount of staff time on CRKN's side to manually approve the articles. So on a weekly basis, myself and one other person on my team, we go into the workflow portal twice a week. And I think we're seeing about an average of 150 to 200 articles per week that we have to manually click on and approve and click again to approve. So there's not a lot of investigation on our part that happens. If they have an institutional email and sort of their name, they've selected the correct institutional affiliation and everything looks squared away there. It's kind of a quick just approve. In some cases where they use a personal email address, like a Hotmail or what have you, Gmail, and something kind of maybe looks a bit off if the name doesn't match the address or something, then we'll do a bit of investigation to see if we can find the author's profile on the institutional website, for example, to like confirm that they're actually affiliated. As far as the resources needed, not particularly much to say there. Like in our case, we're reliant on our member libraries to handle the communication and the education aspect to their faculties about the agreement. As the negotiating consortium, we don't have a direct connection or line of communication to faculty like our librarians do. So the success of adoption by authors really comes down to the relationship between each library and the researchers.
Sure.
Of course, having staff capacity at CRCAN to review and approve all of the articles is a personnel resource that was critical for us to have in place. So as I said, it was myself and one other person assigned to do that work. But I do believe that our members are really appreciate that CRCAN has taken on the administration of this part of the process. So there's a massive benefit, I think, for them. So I'll
absolutely. Great, thank you. And what about Jennifer over at Rowan? What's your experience?
So Rowan, I talked about it a little bit just previously, but after signing, I work with the scholarly communication librarian and our marketing and communication staff member to get the word out about the agreements, and they work to get training and workshops. They work directly with publishers to bring them in to have events to let the faculty know that these exist. They work directly with the faculty about questions to make sure they understand as they come in about questions about, what journal should I be publishing this in, et cetera. So they do a lot of hands-on work with our faculty to make sure that they're getting to the right place with our various different agreements, including the Elsevier agreement. In terms of resources, everything funnels through me right now. It doesn't go anywhere else. Part of that is because with so many agreements launched this year, we wanted to see how they were being used, how frequently, what was involved, who was using them, et cetera. Several of them will probably turn to automatic approvals after this year, but we just wanted to be able to see how the what does it mean, what was going on, all of that sort of thing before we did any sort of automatic use with it. We also make use of tools like Awable and OA Switchboard to help us with things. If they were to move off of my plate, they would move to my staff, and I don't have a very big staff. And of course, they don't understand all the difference between the different models of OA or the different deals. And so that would, of course, take a lot of training and documentation. I mean, I've been creating documentation, right? But all of that sort of resource for me to get them up to speed on things. So whatever we can automate things would be good. But that's what we're using this year for, to decide where we can and where we would need to add more training hours for staff where it needs to be reviewed.
Sure. So. Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important part of that implementation process. Really, is that kind of educational journey, and it's good for the publishers like Elsevier, for example, to kind of take on that onus, because it's a lot of work. And if there aren't things that are streamlined yet, I know OA Switchboard is a thing. I don't know that Elsevier participates yet, of course, but things aren't necessarily streamlined where it's like really obvious. So just having more education, having publishers be able to take on responsibilities like marketing deals and hosting workshops for the libraries is just like super important. Something that I think is a little different in terms of infrastructure versus kind of our Plan S counterparts, right? Where some of those countrywide transformative operations really do have a lot of dedicated infrastructure to be able to support this implementation process, right? So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so the last topic that we want to talk about is outcomes. We won't spend a ton of time here just because transformative agreements are somewhat new to the market, right? Hard to assess really long-term outcomes from less than 1 year sometimes of data. But I'd actually like to start with Jennifer. You just kind of hit on it a little bit with implementation and all the work that goes on there. So how else are you kind of tracking the outcomes of these agreements? Do you have specific metrics that you follow? What's working so far, and what is ending up becoming more difficult than you thought?
Sure. So one of the big things that I know the Associate Provost has asked me for has been to track, not just how many articles have been published within our agreements, but to compare that to how many articles are being published through just regular workflows that are not open access, and then also the cost savings that we're doing. So, how much are we saving our authors by paying through these transformative agreements compared to, like if they were paying out of pocket. And it's just 1 year's worth of data, but it's still, we're still seeing significant cost savings. And then I'm comparing that to the cost of the agreement itself and doing a percentage of cost agreement versus the APC and things like that. The numbers are still pretty striking. And it gives him a talking point when he has conversations with the provost, when he has conversations with the deans, particularly because I break it down also by college. And I just finished this week because one of our medical schools had the question of how many of their authors were publishing through these different agreements. That information is a lot harder to find because usually, you'll get like the first author in the reports. You won't necessarily get all of the authors. It's not always clear what department they're coming from. You have to do a lot of digging. It took me a long time to go back all the way to January to do it, but it's what they want. But it gives you a lot of really good information that you can then, dig in and give to the deans and the, of the colleges and things. So I think for us, that's a very good way to sort of see how this is affecting their faculty and it's bringing a benefit to them and why it's worth paying for these agreements. In terms of the difficult part of the agreement process, I think the hardest thing is just getting faculty that still have maybe some misunderstandings about open access publishing. I know just talking with our scholar communication librarian or just other liaisons or even faculty that I know, there's still some, not clear about how these work or even if they're good for publishing or for tenure packets and things like that. So I think the more of these that we can get and the more they see some of their peers publishing in them and that they're, like these agreements are not predatory, et cetera, et cetera. I think that helps. The agreement itself, at least from the ELSR perspective, it was not hard for me to get that completed.
And Michael, what about from your perspective, kind of taking that like one step removed, right? Now at that dean level, do you have any outcomes or metrics you're specifically tracking? What's going on? From your perspective?
So it's I think a huge topic and one we need to be thinking about as a profession really carefully. And we probably need some standards and maybe we need to rethink what goes into a counter report, right? I think there are a lot of things that we need to be doing to make it so that we're tracking the right things and that we're able to understand this at both a local level and at a global level in terms of each of these deals. So I've done a number of presentations with Jason Price and John McDonald, sometimes with Heather Staines and sometimes as well with Seth Russell at both at Charleston and some other conferences on this broader topic. And so I won't go into detail because I think there's opportunity to sort of dig into that. But we need to understand how the deals that we're signing at the local level are impacting our local authors, but are also impacting sort of the global scholarly communication ecosystem. What is happening in terms of open access more broadly, not just at my institution, because I don't think they fundamentally matter if all they're doing is moving our APC costs from one place to another within the institution. So that's just a thought. The other thing I should say is that well, I'll leave it there on the first question. The second question, I'm going to just focus on a logistical challenge that maybe sort of it shouldn't have been a problem, but it was a big problem. We discovered that for one of our transformative agreements, we were actually approving articles and then they were somehow flipping to unapproved. And
Oh.
we, in discussion with another institution participating in that deal, we discovered they were having the same problem, and that's a little bit scary. And who knows whether it was a one-time thing or whether it could happen again. But it sort of begs the question of are we doing enough in terms of developing our infrastructure and developing standards to manage those things over time? Because imagine not discovering that was happening, and an author thinking they had been compliant with a funder mandate, and then discovering when it's too late that they're actually out of compliance. That's bad for them in terms of getting additional funding, and it's certainly bad for the institution as well.
Sure. Craig, any comments on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think
it's a little bit harder, one step even further removed, but
yeah, I mean, it's an important metric for us being at the early stages of these agreements, and less than 1 full year into this particular one with Elsevier, is just the adoption rate of open access by authors who have the choice to make. So far, our adoption rate's pretty good in the Elsevier deal, but not as high as we'd like to see. But again, it's only been 10 months at this point. And this is by far our largest agreement, still a few months shy of 1 year of full activity. So it could take a bit longer for authors to become aware of their options in these deals, and for engagement and communications from faculty to filter down from the library down to the faculty. Thankfully, within this agreement, we have the ability for authors to change their decision, change their mind, and retroactively convert their articles to OA, as long as they do so before January of the year following publication. So that's great. Something I would want to maybe quickly highlight is that in one of our other agreements, the author workflow process provides an opportunity for authors to indicate why they choose to decline an option to publish in open access. And we get that data from the publisher. We see why the authors state which reasons they state for declining that option. And 90% of the time, it's because they don't understand, and they say they don't have funding to pay for the APC, even though that funding is not needed because the APC is waived. So it's an education thing. As far as difficulty with the agreement process, I wouldn't say anything was truly difficult. However, it took a long time to negotiate the terms of the agreement with Elsevier with respect to having the unlimited publication and having the cost neutrality for the entirety of our agreement. But by the time our annual summit in October happened during that negotiating year, we had a discussion with our members, and we're very thankful to them that they had the strength to stand their ground on those two principles and give CRKN a mandate to continue negotiations until we met our goals. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those insights. So we do have one final question, which we are running out of time, but I think that it's important to just think about, are transformative agreements truly, transformative at that local level, right? So building the agreement and then implementing them are kind of two different beasts in a sense. And one of the challenges around open access does come down to this concept of author choice, right? Authors write articles. Articles are not entities on their own, right? So how do we work with authors to help them make this more educated decision? So we don't have time, I don't think, for the panelists to answer this question, but I challenge you to follow up with them, put questions in the FAQ below, just thinking about whether or not transformative agreements are truly transformative. I want to share a couple of quick resources as well, just some links to the different open access agreements that have been presented in the webinar today. So we've got the Denver libraries as well as Rowan and CRKN listed there. And then finally, some links to some different Elsevier resources. So information on all of our read and publish agreements, as well as our open access policies and standards. And with that, I just want to thank our panelists, Michael, Jennifer, and Craig, really providing just such fascinating insights at all of the different levels of the institutions and kind of what that journey is like to negotiate transformative agreements and then kind of keep tabs on them as we go through this kind of evolution of the publisher landscape. So thank you again. Thank you for your time, and have a good rest of your day.